Hey everybody, welcome to the first live broadcast of the Trigger Words podcast. Bear with me as we figure this thing out, okay? We're not only starting a new podcast with a new format that I'm not used to, but we're going to be trying to mix gun laws and politics and topics in a way that's just not incredibly boring, in a way that you can actually follow along and learn and understand. And we're also going to try to do this live show separate from the actual podcast. So please, if you like this stuff, go seek out the podcast on iTunes or on Google Play or wherever you like to listen to your podcast. Subscribe, and if you like what you hear, give a good review. I'd really appreciate it. That's what's going to help keep this thing going. Also, a big driver of this is going to be the feedback that you guys give. So don't be afraid to write in questions, comments, either to these live videos here or later when the podcast airs, we'll put stuff on there. Like for the website for you to go to be able to, ask questions and things like that. So right now, you're going to be getting the sneak preview before the podcast. So you're going to have to bear with me as I click a couple of buttons and get things set up here. But maybe I'll get the kinks worked out as I go along and I get the technology figured out. I'm trying to post this both on the Trigger Words podcast page and also on the Firearms Radio Network page. So you guys can follow along there. I'll try my best to get your questions and comments, but I'll monitor the Trigger Words podcast page most. So if you're not getting the comments answered over on the Firearms Radio Network, jump on over to Trigger Words, give us a like, and follow along there. So let's see if I can get this going, and we can actually make a podcast out of this that I can record and that you guys can listen along with. Also, let me know when you prefer to have this done. I don't want to compete with the other shows on the Firearms Radio Network. I'm thinking about releasing the podcast on Mondays, but we can do this live broadcast whenever you guys want. So the point is, feedback, I'll take it. We can all make this better together. So let me see here. All right, getting everything started. I think I'm actually ready to go. All right, here we go. I'm going to start the recording, and we're going to get into podcast mode where I'll talk like this for half the time. Sorry for those of you guys watching. All right, so here we go. All right, welcome to the Trigger Words podcast. This show is brought to you by the Firearms Radio Network and presented by Rocket FFL, your best source for getting your FFL and staying compliant with ATF rules and regulations. This podcast focuses on the legal side of gun ownership in the firearms industry. We talk about guns, law, and politics. I'm your host, Ryan Kleckner. I'm a firearms attorney, but I'm not your firearms attorney. Therefore, everything we discuss in this podcast is for your information and entertainment only, is not legal advice. The views and comments expressed in this podcast belong solely to the hosts and the guests and do not necessarily reflect the official position or views of the Firearm Radio Network and or its employees. Listener discretion is advised, especially on live shows. So this podcast being episode number 2, the first episode was an introduction of what this podcast is going to be about and a little bit about me, so at least you had my background and knew who you're listening to. This podcast, I wanted to jump in with some more complex topics that people have already been asking me, and I decided, you know what? No, we've got to do the basics. I've got to start somewhere to give everyone a foundation that we're going to be able to focus on when we go into later episodes. So we're going to be talking about tonight the basic definitions of firearms. And what's great is I was tuning into the We Like Shooting show a little bit earlier, and they were talking about exactly this. I thought about how perfect that timing was to discuss the definition of firearms versus muzzleloaders. Now, this being early on in the podcast, I'm also trying to broadcast this live. So if you're listening to the podcast now, this was already broadcast live at least a couple days ago. I'm doing it on Facebook for right now, so you might hear me interacting with some of the folks that are adding comments or questions, and you're wondering where they're doing that. They're doing it on Facebook, and they're doing it on the Trigger Words podcast page on Facebook. So if you're there, stop by, check us out, like the page, and join in on the live shows. Now, I just mentioned to the people before that were on Facebook, before this podcast started recording, but I don't know when this is going to be every time. I'd love your feedback to hear when is convenient for you that you would like this podcast or at least the live broadcast to be, so you can be a part of this, because I really do think that together we're going to be able to make this show better. Not only am I going to be able to answer the types of questions that you guys are going to want to hear, but you're going to give me great feedback, and we're going to get better from there. So to get to the basic definitions of firearms, this is not only important for what I just said, which is as we build on more complex topics. But I think this is important because I run into this all the time as a firearms attorney. I very often with my clients, especially my manufacturing clients, my FFLs all across the country, and they have a unique problem about trying to import this type of firearm or how they're going to mark or make this firearm or who's going to do what marking variants, and it gets complicated. And I have to remind people often, stop, go back to the basics. What's a firearm? What's a rifle? What's a shotgun? Things like that. If we can go back to the basics, not only can we figure out, as for FFLs, how they're supposed to enter them in the bound books, but also as users, so you know what you're dealing with. You want to make a firearm on your own, that's perfectly legal under federal law. So you just need to know what kind of firearm you're making, and you need to make sure that you don't do the wrong thing when you make it. So let's go ahead and get into some of the definitions. Now, first, a little bit about the law. This podcast, I'm going to warn you guys, might be one of the dry ones because we're going to have to talk about so much of the legal definitions. So I'm going to be reading some of the actual U.S. code to you. I'll keep it to a minimum, and I hope to jump straight into what it means in plain language and real words. But we got to start there. So the U.S. code, when I first even bring that word up, let's talk about what it is. There's a difference between laws and regulations. Laws are drafted by a legislative body. So for federal laws, we're going to talk about Congress. You can have state or local governments can have laws too, but the legislative body drafts the laws and then ends up passing it through whatever their system is, and then gives it to an executive, the president at the federal level, or maybe a governor at a local level, to then sign the law and put it into effect. Well, the laws are usually pretty, I don't know if vague is the right word, but they're fairly strict and all-encompassing. They don't give a whole lot of the details, and that's good. We don't want the federal government, well, in my opinion, we don't want the government giving us too many details on how to live our lives anyway, but we don't want the federal government making really nuanced decisions on exactly how an FFL has to fill out a piece of paper, for example. So we just have the broad laws that say, hey, background checks have to be done. And then we leave it to the agencies to make regulations. So the agencies all work for the executive. So the ATF, which is now part of the Department of Justice, they all report up to the president. So the legislative branch kind of makes the laws, and the president enacts and enforces the laws to these agencies. Well, the agencies are allowed to make these regulations, which are kind of like their own rules to help carry out the law. So a regulation can't just be made on its own. A regulation can only be made to further carry out a specific law. There's always got to be that reference back to what it's doing. So, for example, the ATF will have regulations on the Form 4473, which is the form you fill out when you buy a gun at a gun store. How the format of that form and how the background check must be run and things like that. So the law said you needed background checks. The regulations explain how it needs to be done. So for the firearms definitions, we're going to start in Title 18 of the U.S. Code. Now, Title 18 covers all criminal laws, which that's a whole nother discussion on why gun laws are in the criminal law. I think that's kind of a negative start at the gate there to assume that firearms have to do with crimes, but that's where it is. Now, this is for Gun Control Act laws, is what we're going to be talking about in Title 18. If you want to talk about the NFA, the National Firearms Act, and those firearms, the special class of firearms, silencers and machine guns and short-barreled rifles and quote-unquote scarier guns, those are actually going to be in Title 26 of the U.S. Code, because Title 26 isn't criminal laws. It's actually the Internal Revenue Code. That's right. NFA laws are in the same section of the federal laws as the Internal Revenue Code. And does anyone know why that is? Well, you might know that the ATF wasn't always under the Department of Justice. As actually pretty recently they moved over to the Department of Justice. They used to be under Treasury. And what part of the law does Treasury have an effect over? That's right, the Internal Revenue Code. And that's why when the ATF wanted to regulate these NFA firearms, they didn't regulate them by making certain crimes or certain definitions about background checks or things like that. Instead, what they did is they made taxes. So Department of Treasury can regulate things with taxes, and that's how they did it. So let's jump in to the definitions from Title 18 of the U.S. Code of basic firearms. So a firearm is defined in 18 U.S.C., that stands for U.S. Code, Section 921, and all of 921 is the definition section. So if you ever hear me reference 921 and you see that reference somewhere, you know we're talking about the definitions. So in A3, a firearm is defined. Let me read you the code first. Bear with me. I'll give it to you in plain language in just a second. It says, the term firearm means A, any weapon, including a starter gun, which will or is designed to or may readily be converted to expel a projectile by the action of an explosive. B, the frame or receiver of such a weapon. C, any firearm muffler or firearm silencer. Or D, any destructive device. And it finishes up to say, such term does not include an antique firearm. So just put a pin in the antique firearm part. We'll talk about that in just a second. Let's break down these 4 sections of the definition. So the first section is any weapon which essentially can fire a projectile by the action of an explosive. That means you have a boom and a projectile go flying out the other end. That's a firearm under federal law. Now, everything we're going to talk about here is federal law definitions only. Some states have different definitions of firearms. New Jersey, for example, says a projectile comes out, it's a firearm. So a BB gun is a firearm in New Jersey. There doesn't have to be an explosion. But some of these more powerful air rifles that people are getting, which are now suitable for some hunting, those technically aren't firearms. There's no explosion. So in order for it to be a firearm, it has to have an explosion, the gunpowder. I guess it could be a hairspray if you're making a potato gun. Yes, a potato gun that uses hairspray is a firearm, whereas a potato gun that uses compressed air is not a firearm. Remember, no explosion. So the explosion and the projectile going out is the definition. But there's a little part in there that I want to go back and hit. It says, or may be readily converted to. What that tells us is not only are firearms, but also things that aren't quite yet finished. They're firearms too. So that's where we get this term 80% receiver, which is a misnomer. It is a marketing term only. There's nothing in the law about 80%. Matter of fact, I think that term can be a little dangerous because some people believe that if it's not quote unquote 80% finished, it's not a gun yet. That's wrong. You could get yourself in serious trouble by making a 10% firearm, depending on which part of the firearm you made. You see, these quote unquote 80% receivers have been blessed by the ATF that they've not quite been finished enough yet where they cross that imaginary line of readily converted. That's the phrase from the law. So the ATF has determined there's still enough work done to that left in order for it to be completely finished that it doesn't count as readily converted. It's just almost done. Well, on an AR-15, for example, the ATF has come out and gave some pretty specific guidance, and I have some articles for that, and all these things, the codes, the explanations I'm giving you, we will include this in the show's notes at triggerwordspodcast.com, and you'll be able to also find them on the Firearms Radio Network website for the show notes there for the Trigger Words podcast. And also on triggerwordspodcast.com is where you're going to find contact information if you want to submit questions or comments about the show. So the AR-15 receivers, the ATF has come out and said effectively the trigger pocket, which is the area where the hammer and the trigger and the pins go and the safety goes, once that's milled out at all, I mean, once that surface is scratched and barely removed, you've now crossed that magically readily converted line. So you can have the magazine well broached, you can have all sorts of things milled on it, you can have all the markings, you can have a lot of it done, but that trigger pocket, once you start touching that, that's now crossed the line into readily converted. Now, it's not illegal to do that on your own. You're completely allowed, again, under federal law, to make your own firearm. You really can. And if you make it for yourself, you don't have to mark up the serial number or anything. Now, be careful of state laws, but there's not this necessary problem on milling out that trigger well by yourself. The problem is when a manufacturer or a company does it, and then they want to sell it in interstate commerce and ship it to you. That's why it can't be done yet. So it's not bad or wrong for that part to be milled out. That's just bad or wrong to have that part milled out and then have it up on a website for sale that you're trying to ship interstate commerce without going to an FFL. So they just stop just shy of where it needs to be readily convertible to a firearm, and they can ship it to you, and then you can make it at home. And the ATF determines that there's just as much effort there as there would have been to build one from scratch or to build any other kind of rudimentary firearm. So what's the big deal, right? You're still making your own gun. Just remember that, though. Not only is it when it's done, at some point before it's done, and every firearm is different. And if you want to know for sure, you have to get a ruling from the ATF. Now, I have a good enough eye for this that I'll work with manufacturers and be able to look at parts and say, that one at about step 7 out of 10, that's a firearm. But this one over here at step 1, you've made it a firearm. Remember I said that 80% is a misnomer? Well, if you took a billet casting, it's going to be a billet and a casting at the same time. I don't know. You know what I mean. If you take just the casting of the AR-15 receiver that has no milling and no work done to it at all, and you start on the trigger pocket, well, maybe you've only completed 10% of the firearm, but it would definitely be a firearm. So again, don't pay attention to the 80%. Pay attention to the functionality, depending on what's been done to it. If you don't know, reach out and ask. And if you're thinking about doing these kind of things, of course, please come use my company, Rocket FFL. I'd appreciate the support. You can take a course on it, and I actually have courses and classes that teach you these kind of things. And if you need some attorney support, which this podcast nor those courses give you, you can reach out to me and hire me as an attorney if you want. But I think you'll find through a lot of the research in the courses, you'll find the information on your own. So, all right, let's get back to the definition and let's jump to part B, which says the frame or receiver of any such weapon. Okay, so now we kind of already have three things that are firearms. We have something with an explosion that launches a projectile. That's a firearm. We have some sort of device that's not quite a firearm yet, but it's close enough to being a firearm that it's considered to be readily converted to a firearm. And now we have the frame or receiver of a firearm. Well, the frame or receiver surely can't expel a projectile by the action of an explosive, so that's why they had to make a second part there for it. And I kind of get this one. I mean, you take a car apart into all its pieces, you don't have 1,000 cars. You have one car in 1,000 pieces. So just like as a car, you have to decide, I don't know, we'll call the frame of a car the car, and everything else is just a part. You have to do the same thing with a firearm. You take a firearm apart on your table, you don't want to have 50 firearms. You still want to have one. So we got to pick one part to call the firearm, and that is the frame or receiver. So just be careful here too. It's incorrect to say that that's the only part of the firearm that's a firearm. That just also is one. So the frame or receiver by itself is the firearm, and the entire thing together, if it uses an explosion to expel projectiles, a firearm. This is going to come in to the point later on antique firearms. So remember that it's not only the frame or receiver, but it's also the frame or receiver in addition to using an explosive. And we'll talk about that when we get to muzzleloaders, and you'll see where we go with that. So part C says any firearm muffler or firearm silencer. Well, that's kind of weird to me because they've now taken the Gun Control Act, which came out later, and even though they call it Title I, there's a little sidebar for you. So on the Gun Control Act, you have kind of two titles is what we call them. We have Title I firearms and Title II firearms. And the Gun Control Act firearms, which are standard firearms, are typically referred to as Title I, even though it came out later. And the National Firearms Act, which came out in 1934, much earlier, is called Title II. So go figure. But they took a Title II firearm and have included it in the Gun Control Act. They really wanted silencers to be included, I guess. Now, notice I said silencer, and notice the law says silencer. I don't say suppressor. I mean, maybe I will, and you'll catch me doing it sometimes. But that whole debate, I don't get. The law calls them silencers. I'm a firearms attorney. The ATF calls them silencers, so I call them silencers too. Either way, they're included as part of the firearm. And D, any destructive device. You know what? Let's save that for a future podcast. Destructive devices are things like hand grenades. So we can cover that later. Right now, we're going to do just the basics. So I hope you guys are following along with that so far. It can be a few things. It's important to know what it is. Now let's talk about what the exceptions are, because just as with almost any law out there, you're going to have exceptions. So let's talk about what they are. I already mentioned it. In the definition, it says such term does not include an antique firearm. Oh, great. What's an antique firearm? Well, go figure. It's not what you think it is. The federal government has an interesting way of defining antique. And this is one of those times where I'm happy that the definition doesn't really make sense because it's better for us. But going further down in the law, down to section 16, we find the law says the term antique firearm means A, any firearm, including any firearm with a matchlock, flintlock, percussion cap, or similar type of ignition system, manufactured in or before 1898. Well, I don't understand why they didn't just say before 1899. But if you ask me, before 1899 kind of covers in or before 1898. But I didn't write the laws. I'm not a congressman. So old guns are antique firearms. We get that. That one makes sense. Okay. Well, part B of that definition now is any replica of any firearm described in subparagraph A if the replica, 1, is not designed or redesigned for using rimfire or conventional centerfire fixed ammunition, or 2, uses rimfire or conventional centerfire fixed ammunition, which is no longer manufactured in the United States and which is not readily available in the ordinary channels of commerce or trade. So let's break that one down. So it doesn't just have to be an old gun made before 1899. It can be a replica of one of those guns. Now, being a replica means it could have been made this morning. That's right. A device, I almost called it a firearm, and it's not technically a firearm. A gun, I'll call it that, a gun that was made this morning actually can meet the definition of a, quote, antique firearm and therefore be exempted from the definition of firearm if it's not designed or redesigned for using rimfire or conventional centerfire fixed ammunition. Well, what does that leave? Muzzleloaders? Potato guns, maybe? I don't think so, unless you made a really replica potato gun. But the point is, it's not made to use what we would normally call standard cartridges or ammunition. It's okay. But even if it does, even if the replica uses fixed ammunition, either rimfire or centerfire, as long as the fixed ammunition is so rare that it's not made anymore or it's not available in the, quote, ordinary channels of commercial trade. And there is some listings of these, and I will try and share them in the show notes for you to show what those kind of things are so you can see if what you have is an antique firearm. But the muzzleloaders that we're going to talk about next are actually covered in the third part of the antique firearm paragraph, and they are, Part C, any muzzle-loading rifle, muzzle-loading shotgun, or muzzle-loading pistol, which is designed to use black powder or a black powder substitute, and which cannot use fixed ammunition. For purposes of this paragraph, the term antique firearm shall not include any weapon which incorporates a firearm frame or receiver, any firearm which is converted into a muzzle-loading weapon, or any muzzle-loading weapon which can be readily converted to fire fixed ammunition by replacing the barrel, bolt, breech block, or any combination thereof. Whew, okay, that was a long one. Let's break that one down. Essentially, muzzleloaders aren't firearms because they're, quote, antique firearms. Again, even if it's made this morning, your muzzleloader is considered an antique firearm and therefore a non-firearm. Now here's the caveat. All those things in there that said as long as it can't be changed or converted or, well, that's a problem, right? So some manufacturers will make like a break-open style muzzleloader. That's not necessarily a firearm just because it's break-open, but if that manufacturer also sells or if there's available barrels to snap onto that would fire a fixed ammunition cartridge, now you got a firearm. So like Thompson Center, there are models of their muzzleloaders that they sell as firearms because in the drop-down list on their website of accessories, you can buy a 30-06 barrel for it. So that's smart for some people that only want one gun, and then they want to be able to have muzzleloading hunting season, and they want to be able to have a single-shot, modern firearm. But they need to be careful because when it's in the muzzleloading condition, it's not exempted as an antique firearm. It's not at all because it can be readily changed into a regular firearm just by switching the barrel. So just when you're in a gun store or when you're buying a gun from someone at a yard sale or wherever you're at, be careful. Just because it looks like a muzzleloader and is a muzzleloader doesn't mean it meets the same exemption as an antique firearm. The good news is those are rare. Most muzzleloaders, including the break-open ones, are true antique firearms. And so the manufacturers will actually make the length of the chamber or where it locks in for the locking lugs and the breech face, they'll make it such a different dimension that you couldn't possibly interchange the barrels. Or it would take so much machining and time, cutting a half-inch off or extending a barrel by a half-inch, to make it fit, for example. It would take so much machining and time that you might as well just make your own firearm. So the ATF isn't trying to prevent you from modifying something at home with serious tools and care because you could do that from scratch anyway. They're not concerned about that. They're concerned about that readily converted line. So most muzzleloaders are exempted, but then you have part of the definition which says if it incorporates a firearm frame or receiver. Well, my days at Remington, we came out with a muzzleloader that by the time it came out and I saw it through the product development cycle, I had to come running and go, hey, everybody, bad news. That's a firearm. And everybody that I talked to was shocked about it. We had to explain that they made a Remington 700 muzzleloader. Neat idea. I think the concept is awesome. But despite the fact that it's a muzzleloader, it was, and despite the fact that it would be hard to change the barrel, you could do it at home, but it requires some work, and maybe we could get a good argument with the ATF that it's not readily done. Even though that could be done, it still had a Remington 700 receiver in it. So the way I explained it to people is imagine you took a true muzzleloader, something that was really exempted as an antique firearm, and then you just like zip tied a firearm receiver to it, and you held that whole conglomeration up, that would be treated as a firearm because right there is a firearm frame or receiver. The readily converted doesn't matter anymore. You flat out have, if we go back to the original definition of what a firearm is, you flat out have one of the definitions of firearm, the frame or receiver. We're kind of skipping past section A, which is the readily converted, or which is not an antique firearm type stuff. We're skipping past that. We're going to part B, which says, or a firearm frame or receiver. So right there, that firearm frame or receiver, that's the firearm. There happens to be a muzzleloader built on it, but you got to be careful. So we had to notify and warn people, hey, you got this in your gun shop. Yeah, it's a muzzleloader. Be careful. You have to transfer this on the Form 4473, just like every single other firearm, and you got to keep it in your books. And we have to warn people about these kind of things. And you need to be careful too. Now, the reason you need to be careful is not only for the FFLs to transfer it properly, you may not have to worry about that as much, but when you go to sell one of these, you go to ship it somewhere, you have a firearm now. You can't just ship these things to somebody else across state lines. Believe it or not, under federal law, you can ship it to someone in your own state. A lot of people think you can't ship firearms. That's not true. There's no law that says you can't ship a firearm. It just says you can't do an interstate transfer of a firearm. And we won't get into it now, but that has to do with, federal laws really can only control interstate commerce, and the way the Supreme Court's defined that now, it includes almost everything. But something that happens within your own state, federal government really doesn't have much of a say over. So you could ship a firearm, but when you have this thing that's a muzzleloader and you think you're just shipping it to your buddy in another state, because you can ship muzzleloaders in the mail. You can go into a Cabela's catalog and order a muzzleloader, and they'll ship it to your house. If you have what you thought was a muzzleloader, but was in fact a firearm, you might be setting yourself and the other person up for a whole world of trouble. So be very careful when you have these. Now, I really want to get into the new Silencer Co. Maxim 50 because it's a really neat idea they had there with the muzzleloader and the silencer, but I think we're going to have to hold off because there's too much of a discussion for that. So stay tuned for the next podcast. I'll try and get it in the next episode. We'll talk about that one. Right now, I want to finish up with some of the basic definitions still. As we know what a firearm is, let's talk about the basic definitions of the different types of main firearms, or Title I or Gun Control Act common firearms. So first, let's start with a rifle. A rifle, I'm not going to read the law on this one. I'll just tell you what it is. A rifle is a firearm. We know what a firearm is. That has a rifled barrel and is designed and intended to be fired from the shoulder. That's it. That's what makes a rifle. So really, if you had a 30-06 rifle, but for some reason the manufacturer left the rifling out of the barrel and the barrel was smooth, well, you technically now have a shotgun. Because a shotgun is similar to the definition of a rifle, except it's a smooth barrel. So a shotgun is any firearm with a smooth barrel that's designed and intended to be fired from the shoulder. So technically under federal law, if you're thinking about this, you could have a pump-action shotgun, quote-unquote shotgun, with a rifled slug barrel on it, and it's really a rifle under federal law. And you could have a smoothbore 30-06 because of a mistake. You would never want to do that on purpose, and you would have a 30-06 shotgun. The definition for a shotgun doesn't have anything to do with shotgun shells. And a rifle doesn't have anything to do with rifle cartridges because there's really no real good definition for that. It's all about rifling in the barrel or a smooth barrel. Now, don't panic on me, you hunters out there that want to use rifled slug barrels and your state's laws require use of a shotgun. It's still a shotgun under those state's laws. The states actually have that in there. You use a shotgun, and they often define it as firing a shotgun shell. So we're, again, talking about federal laws only. Now, a handgun, the definition of a handgun is a firearm that's designed and intended to be fired with one hand. Well, I don't know how you would ever know the intent of somebody that made a gun, but I shoot a handgun with two hands. But that's actually the definition, is designed and intended to be fired with one hand. And if you're already thinking ahead a little bit, we won't get into it now, but if you are thinking ahead a little bit, you might already be seeing where some of the NFA issues come in here, right? Well, I will get into it a little. We'll tease it. And you take a forward pistol grip and you put it on a Glock pistol, you've just made an NFA firearm. And the reason is it's no longer a handgun. It's not designed and intended to be fired with one hand. That vertical forward pistol grip means you've now designed it to be fired with two hands, and you're now going into the category of any other weapon. And we'll cover NFA firearms on another episode. So back to the rifle definition. The overall length of the rifle needs to be 26 inches or greater, and the barrel length needs to be 16 inches or greater to be considered a standard rifle. If you get shorter than either one of those dimensions, you're now dealing with a short-barreled rifle, and that's an NFA firearm. Well, a shotgun, the barrel has to be 18 inches or greater. So the way you measure a barrel is not with a measuring tape on the outside of the firearm. The way you're supposed to measure it officially is to close the bolt and then use something like a wooden dowel to stick down the barrel and up against the closed bolt, and then mark the furthest permanent extension. So if there's a flash hider or a muzzle device on the firearm and it's permanently attached, well, you're going to mark to the very end of the furthest point of that, pull the dowel out, and measure that. And that's how you're sure what's going on. If you're at a gun show and you see a gun and it looks a little too close to call, you might want to check, because you're the one that's going to get in trouble when you get caught with a short-barreled rifle because it was 15 3/4 inches and you thought it was 16 because you measured from the outside, or you just trusted whoever you're getting it with. So I want to get into so much more, but I want to try and keep these episodes into a palatable format. And I warned you, this one was going to be kind of dry when it comes to all the definitions. I tried not to read from the law so much, but I hope you get it. Let's recap real quick. We talked about the difference between laws and regulations. By the way, regulations have to be followed too, but we talked only about laws tonight, and the laws on the basic definitions on what a firearm is, the main exemption to a firearm, which is antique firearms and how they could be made this morning. And then we got into the basic definitions of what a rifle, a shotgun, and a handgun is. Now, those get super, super important when you get into the NFA. So we'll get into those in a future episode, and I'll stop and warn everybody to come back and listen to episode 2 if you have not done so already, because these are the foundation to understanding why a tourist judge is not considered an AOW or a short-barreled shotgun or something like that, or why the SIG pistol brace is allowed, even if you do happen to fire it from the shoulder. We can get into the weeds there on that one. So the takeaway for the muzzleloader, and the reason I really wanted to bring it up and what came up on the We Like Shooting show, was, can felons have them? Well, we'll talk about this in the future too, but felons, among a whole other group of people, we'll cover those called prohibited persons, are not allowed to possess firearms nor ammunition. It's not just guns. They get caught with a round of ammunition, they're actually in trouble. And as we'll cover later, the definition of ammunition includes every component. So under the law, the definition says a full cartridge of ammunition and every component thereof: primer, brass, powder, and bullet. So if a felon has a piece of brass in their pocket, they're breaking the law, because that piece of brass by itself is considered ammunition. So some felons will want to be able to go hunting, or maybe they are have had a misdemeanor domestic violence, or maybe they were dishonorably discharged from the military and they're part of this prohibited persons class, and they still want a gun, for lack of a better term. They can still get one as long as it's an antique firearm, because the prohibition of the law says that these felons, these other prohibited persons, can't possess firearms. So you will actually hear stories of felons that just have a black powder revolver, or they have a black powder rifle that's truly an antique firearm. And that's where it comes into play. So I hope you guys learned something tonight. I hope I didn't bore you. I'm a little nervous about it because we just started this off. So make sure and give us some feedback. Write into us and let us know if this is the kind of stuff you want to hear, if you learned something tonight. And I hope you share, not only through links and on social media, but tell your friends about the podcast. I'd love to have more people involved so we can get even more comments and we can get more people learning here. Subscribe to the podcast, please, on either iTunes or Google Play or wherever you hear your podcast. And come by if you'd like to see the live broadcasts, which I still don't know what date and time we're going to do them on, but they'll be on the Trigger Words Podcast Facebook page and also the Firearms Radio Network page. Thanks again, everybody, and I will see you, or you will hear me, next time. Okay, people that are listening live, you're getting like extra stuff right now. I just stopped the podcast, and we'll go from there. I'm going to come back and see how it looks, how it was working on the screen. If you guys are letting me know or yelling at me that you can't hear me and I just did the whole thing without knowing, we'll see. I hope you enjoyed it. Yeah. Don't forget to tell me when a night you guys would like to listen to this is going to be. I may not listen to it. I may just do it when I want to do it anyway. But it'll at least let me know what's going on. Let me jump over to the Firearms Radio Network page real quick here and make sure that the video made it there, because I'm not quite sure it did. So, if you can't tell, I kind of am used to having to explain those over and over. So it's kind of nice having them on the podcast. So the next time I have to explain this to somebody, I can just say, go look up the Trigger Words podcast and see episode 2. I should probably keep a list for myself of what we cover in each podcast. So I can just, as I'm talking to people, episode 2, episode 27, I can just send people off to see what's going on there. So looks like everything went through okay. Man, I appreciate you guys tuning in. Hope to see you next time. Hope to grow this and make it keep going. Everybody, take care.